Midnight, 20 Forgotten Secrets of Appalachia, so unbelievable you'll think they're just local legends. But what you're about to discover is far more disturbing than any tale whispered around mountain campfires. Deep in the isolated hollows of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to ancient hills like secrets refusing to fade, there existed families whose bloodlines never wandered beyond the ridges surrounding them. 028, the year was 1923, and the Fugate family of Troublesome Creek had become something the outside world could barely comprehend. Their skin was blue. Not metaphorically, not slightly tinted, but genuinely blue, like the summer sky reflected in their faces. 4 generations, this family carried a genetic condition called methemoglobinemia, passed down through countless unions between cousins, uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters-in-law who all shared grandparents. 102. The isolation of these mountains created biological islands where the same blood circulated in an endless, tightening loop. Martin Fugate arrived from France in 1820, settling in the remote hills of Perry County. He carried a recessive gene that, under normal circumstances, would have disappeared into the genetic diversity of America's melting pot. 127. But Martin married his cousin Elizabeth Smith, and they built their cabin in a hollow so remote that traveling 5 miles took an entire day. Their children had no choice but to marry within the limited pool of neighbors, who were inevitably also relatives. By the early 20th century, the Fugate family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled vine strangling itself. 153. Benjamin Fugate married his second cousin Rachel. Their son Zachariah wed his first cousin Mary. Each generation tightened the genetic noose, and with each marriage between relatives, the recessive gene for blue skin had a greater chance of expressing itself. Luna Fugate was born in 1906, and the midwife nearly dropped her when she emerged. 217. The baby's skin was the deep blue of a bruise, her lips almost purple. Her mother wept, not from joy, but from a terrible understanding that the family curse had struck again. Luna's brother, Zachary, was equally blue. Their condition was so pronounced that when they started school, other children fled, screaming, convinced they were demons or the walking dead. 240. The family's isolation wasn't accidental. The Appalachian Mountains created natural barriers, but social forces built even higher walls. When outsiders learned of the blue people, they didn't offer help or understanding. They offered ridicule, fear, and eventually deliberate avoidance. This forced the Fugates deeper into their genetic trap. 304. With no new blood entering the family line, the blue skin became more common, more intense, more undeniable with each generation. Life in their hollow followed rhythms unchanged for a century. They farmed small plots of rocky soil, hunted deer and turkey in forests that seemed to swallow sound, and gathered for Sunday services in a one-room church where everyone shared at least 3 sets of grandparents. 330. The men married women they'd known since birth, often their own cousins or nieces. The women had no choice but to accept proposals from male relatives trapped by geography, poverty, and a culture that normalized what the outside world called abomination. Dr. Madison Corin wouldn't discover the scientific explanation until 1960. 355. But the Fugates already understood the truth in their bones. They were paying the price for genetic isolation, for bloodlines that never mixed with fresh streams. Each blue baby was a reminder that their family had been breeding with itself for so long that hidden traits emerged like buried secrets clawing their way to the surface. 418. The condition affected more than just skin color. The Fugate children struggled with shortness of breath, fatigue, and a constant feeling of suffocation even in open air. Their blood couldn't carry oxygen properly, leaving them perpetually exhausted as if the weight of their twisted family tree pressed down on their lungs. Yet, they survived, reproduced, and passed the curse to the next generation. 443. Because in those isolated hollows, survival meant accepting whatever life and family gave you. Neighboring families whispered about the Fugates, but they weren't unique. The Whitaker family, the Colt clan, the Blue family of Troublesome Creek. Dozens of Appalachian lineages had become closed genetic loops. 506, each one producing its own signature of inbreeding. Some had extra fingers, others had severe mental limitations, and some developed conditions medical science wouldn't identify for decades. The mountains hid these families like shameful secrets, and the families hid themselves in return. By 1930, the Fugate family numbered over 60 people, nearly all of them related through multiple lines of descent. 534. Family reunions were redundant because every gathering was already a family reunion. The blue-skinned members were treated with a strange mixture of acceptance and horror. Within the family, they were just Luna, just Zachary, just another cousin. But when rare outsiders stumbled into their hollow, the blue people were hidden in back rooms, kept away from windows, treated like evidence of something unspeakable. 603. The children grew up knowing they were different, but not fully understanding why. They played in the same creek where their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had played, in a landscape that never changed because nothing new ever arrived. The same bloodlines, the same land, the same genetic lottery that kept producing the same results. 626. Blue skin, breathing problems, and an unspoken understanding that their family was both their entire world and their prison. As the 1930s descended upon Appalachia with the full weight of the Great Depression, the genetic consequences of isolation became impossible to ignore. The Fugate family's blue skin was merely the most visible symptom of a deeper rot spreading through bloodlines that had been closed for too long. 709. In the neighboring county, the Whitaker family had their own genetic legacy. Unlike the Fugates, their condition wasn't visible in skin color, but in the structure of their minds and bodies. 3 generations of cousin marriages had produced children with severe cognitive impairments, some unable to speak, others trapped in the developmental stage of toddlers despite being adults. 735. The family lived in a ramshackle collection of buildings connected by mud paths, their world shrinking each year as the outside world forgot they existed. Ray Whitaker, born in 1932, was the product of a union between first cousins who were themselves the children of first cousins. His parents, both carrying recessive genes for intellectual disability, created a genetic storm when they reproduced. 804. Ray would never learn to read, never hold a job, never marry outside his immediate family circle. He spent his days rocking on a porch that tilted dangerously, communicating in grunts and gestures, his mind locked in a fog that no amount of patience or teaching could penetrate. But Ray wasn't alone. 826. His sister Betty was equally impaired, as were 4 of their 6 siblings. The family survived on subsistence farming and the charity of slightly less affected relatives, trapped in a cycle where the only available marriage partners were people who shared their genetic burden. When Betty grew into womanhood, she married her cousin Timmy, himself the son of another cousin marriage. 850. Their children were born with even more severe impairments, some unable to walk, others with facial deformities that made eating difficult and speaking impossible. The mountain communities developed a cruel pragmatism about such families. They were helped when absolutely necessary, avoided when possible, and never ever mentioned to outsiders. 915. Local doctors, the few who ventured into these remote areas, learned to treat conditions they'd never encountered in medical school. Babies born with hearts on the wrong side of their chests. Children with 6-fingered hands. Adults whose eyes couldn't track movement properly. These were the calling cards of inbreeding. 937. Genetic markers that announced themselves with brutal honesty. The Colt family, living in a hollow so remote it didn't appear on most maps, had perhaps the darkest story. For 4 generations, starting in the 1880s, they had practiced what could only be called deliberate genetic isolation. The patriarch Jeremiah Colt believed that mixing blood with outsiders weakened the family line. 1004. He encouraged his children to marry each other, arranged unions between siblings, and created a dynasty of genetic disaster that would echo through the decades. By 1940, the Colt family included members who couldn't survive outside the family compound. Some had legs that wouldn't straighten, forcing them to walk in a permanent crouch. 1027. Others had respiratory systems so compromised that climbing a single flight of stairs left them gasping. Mental impairment was so common that normal intelligence was the exception rather than the rule. Yet they continued to reproduce within the family. Each generation adding new layers of genetic damage to an already crumbling foundation. 1051. The women in these families suffered disproportionately. They bore child after child. Many born dead or dying. Their bodies unable to carry the genetic load of inbreeding. Miscarriages were common. Infant mortality was staggering. And those children who survived often required constant care for their entire lives. A woman might give birth 10 times and see only 3 children reach adulthood. 1117, each pregnancy a gamble with genetics that the family almost always lost. Social isolation reinforced genetic isolation. The blue-skinned Fugates, the mentally impaired Whitakers, the physically deformed Colts, they all retreated further into their hollows, building higher walls of secrecy around their communities. 1140, outsiders who accidentally stumbled upon these families left with stories that sounded like folklore. Tales of blue people and six-fingered families that seemed too bizarre to be real. But they were real. Horrifyingly real. Living evidence of what happens when human bloodlines circle back on themselves too many times. 1202, the few children who showed normal development faced an impossible choice. Stay and accept the genetic lottery of cousin marriage or leave and abandon the only family they'd ever known. Most stayed. The mountains held them like gravity. The family bonds proved stronger than the desire for genetic health, and the cycle continued. A boy with normal intelligence would grow up, marry his cousin, because she was the only unmarried woman in the hollow, and produce children who might carry forward the genetic burden for another generation. Local churches. 1237, preached against marrying close relatives, but the sermons rang hollow in communities where everyone was already related. A preacher might thunder about the sins of inappropriate unions, then go home to a wife who was his second cousin. The hypocrisy was understood but never acknowledged. A communal secret that everyone shared and nobody discussed. 1302, by the time World War II pulled young men out of the mountains and into the wider world, some families had been genetically isolated for over a century. The Fugates had their blue skin. The Whitakers had their cognitive impairments. The Colts had their physical deformities. And dozens of other families had their own genetic signatures. 1325, club feet, deafness, blindness, conditions that appeared in every generation with predictable regularity. The 1960s brought something new to the isolated hollows of Appalachia. Scientific curiosity. Dr. Madison Corin, a hematologist from the University of Kentucky, heard rumors of the blue people and decided to investigate what others had dismissed as mountain folklore. 1353, what he found in 1960 was the Fugate family, still blue, still isolated, still reproducing within their closed genetic circle. Patrick and Rachel Fugate, both blue-skinned and both descendants of multiple cousin marriages, welcomed Dr. Corin into their home with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. They had lived their entire lives as medical curiosities, avoided by neighbors, stared at by strangers. 1422, their condition untreatable because nobody understood what caused it. Dr. Corin spent months studying the family's blood, mapping their genealogy, and documenting the intricate web of relationships that had created this genetic phenomenon. What he discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. The Fugates carried a recessive gene for methemoglobinemia, a condition that prevents blood from carrying oxygen efficiently. 1451, in a normal population, this gene would appear perhaps once in millions of people. But in the Fugates' closed genetic loop, where the same ancestors appeared dozens of times in each person's family tree, the gene had become common. The family tree Corin constructed looked like a nightmare of crossed lines and circular connections. 1516, Martin Fugate appeared as an ancestor to every single blue-skinned family member. Sometimes 8 or 10 times in one person's lineage. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and cousins married each other so frequently that calculating genetic relationships became almost impossible. The blue skin was just the most visible result of this genetic consolidation. 1539, hidden beneath were countless other conditions, some minor, some devastating, all the result of a gene pool that had been stirred with the same spoon for far too long. Corin's treatment was remarkably simple. Methylene blue dye injected into the bloodstream could temporarily alleviate the symptoms, but the cure was temporary because the genetic cause remained. 1606, each Fugate who received the injection would see their skin return to normal within hours only to fade back to blue within days. The treatment offered a glimpse of normalcy but couldn't erase the genetic reality written into every cell of their bodies. Luna Fugate, now in her 50s, wept when she saw her skin turn pink for the first time in her life. 1631, she stared at her hands, at her face in a mirror, and experienced a moment of profound grief for all the years she'd spent blue, avoided, treated as something less than human. But the moment passed, the blue returned, and Luna understood that some genetic legacies can't be erased with a simple injection. The publicity surrounding Corin's discovery brought unwanted attention to the Fugates and other isolated families. 1659, journalists descended on the hollows, cameras flashing, notebooks filling with sensational stories about America's hidden genetic disasters. The families retreated even further, building literal and metaphorical fences to keep the curious away. Some families moved deeper into the mountains to places even more remote where they could continue their lives without judgment or scrutiny. 1724, but the scientific awakening couldn't be stopped. Geneticists began studying other isolated communities, documenting the effects of generations of cousin marriage. What they found was a catalogue of genetic horrors. Communities where half the children were born with cleft palates. Families where diabetes and heart disease appeared in every generation. 1748, isolated populations with rates of genetic disorders hundreds of times higher than the national average. The Whittaker family, discovered by researchers in 1967, became a case study in the long-term effects of genetic isolation. Over 5 generations, the family had produced 43 members, of which 31 showed some form of cognitive or physical impairment. 1814, the researchers mapped the relationships and found that every member of the 4th and 5th generations was the product of at least 3 different cousin marriages in their immediate ancestry. The genetic diversity that protects most populations had been completely erased, replaced by a genetic monotony that expressed itself in profound disability. 1836, when researchers interviewed Lorraine Whittaker, a woman of relative normalcy in a family devastated by genetic disorders, she explained the family's logic with heartbreaking simplicity. "We married who was there. Nobody else would have us and we couldn't leave. This is our home, our land, our family. If that means marrying your cousin, well, that's what you do." 1902, her words captured the trap perfectly. Geographic isolation created social isolation, which created genetic isolation, which created physical and mental conditions that increased social isolation, completing a vicious cycle that had been spinning for generations. Breaking free required resources, education, and opportunities that simply didn't exist in these remote hollows. 1930, the research also revealed families that had deliberately chosen genetic isolation. The Colt clan, when finally studied in depth in 1971, admitted that their patriarch had actively discouraged marriage outside the family. Jeremiah Colt's belief in keeping the bloodline pure had created a genetic nightmare. But his descendants, even though suffering from the effects, defended his choice. 8 p.m., he wanted to keep us together, explained Marcus Colt, a man with severe physical deformities and limited cognitive function. "Family is everything. We don't need outsiders." Ad died. "This was the moment where I need you to feel something." Think about Luna Fugate looking at her pink hands, or Lorraine Whittaker explaining why she married her cousin, or Marcus Colt defending the very beliefs that destroyed his health. 2028, if you're watching this and thinking about how society fails its most vulnerable people, drop a comment right now saying isolation isn't just geographic, it's genetic, social, and tragically permanent. Let me know you understand the depth of this tragedy. By the 1980s, improved roads and mandatory education laws began penetrating even the most remote Appalachian communities. 2057, the genetic isolation that had persisted for over a century started to crack, but the damage had already been done. The children and grandchildren of cousin marriages carried genetic time bombs that would express themselves for generations to come. The Fugate family's blue skin began appearing less frequently as some members married outsiders, diluting the genetic concentration that caused the condition. But other effects persisted. 2126, heart problems, breathing difficulties, and a predisposition to blood disorders ran through the family like underground rivers, invisible but still flowing. Sarah Fugate, born in 1978 to parents who were second cousins, didn't have blue skin, but collapsed during gym class at age 14. Her heart unable to handle normal exertion. 2151, The doctors traced her condition back through 4 generations of cousin marriages, each one adding a small genetic weakness that finally manifested in Sarah's failing heart. The Whittaker family situation proved even more intractable. The severe cognitive impairments that affected so many members couldn't be undone by introducing new genetic material. 2215, the damage was permanent, encoded into the family's DNA like a sentence written in permanent ink. By 1990, social services had finally discovered the family, and what they found was shocking even to professionals accustomed to poverty and neglect. 3 generations lived in a cluster of dilapidated structures without running water or electricity. 2239, the adults, many of them mentally impaired, cared for children who were even more severely affected. Incestuous relationships continued because the impaired adults didn't understand why they shouldn't reproduce with their relatives. Social workers removed several children, but the family's isolation and the adults' inability to comprehend complex social rules meant that new children continued to be born into the same genetic trap. 2309, the Colt family's story took a darker turn when authorities discovered them in 1984. What had been a deliberate policy of genetic isolation had become something more sinister. Multiple generations were living in a compound where appropriate relationships had completely broken down. Brothers and sisters, parents and children, uncles and nieces, the boundaries that most societies maintain had dissolved entirely. 2337, the children removed from the compound showed signs of profound genetic damage, physical deformities, severe cognitive impairments, and medical conditions that doctors had only read about in textbooks. When geneticists analyzed DNA samples from the Colt family, they found something unprecedented in modern America. 2400 hours, genetic diversity levels comparable to endangered species on the brink of extinction. The family had become so genetically homogeneous that members shared more DNA with each other than typical siblings. Some of the children were technically the product of relationships so close that they were more inbred than if their parents had been identical twins. 2400 hours 22, the legal system struggled with how to handle these families. Was it abuse if the parents genuinely didn't understand that their actions were harmful? Could you prosecute people for relationships that their community had normalized for over a century? The cases dragged through courts with experts testifying about genetic damage, social workers describing living conditions, and family members defending their way of life with passionate confusion. 2400 hours 52, public reaction was swift and brutal. News programs featured the families as examples of American poverty and neglect. Photographs of severely impaired children circulated and politicians promised crackdowns on isolated communities. But the outrage faded quickly and the families were left to deal with consequences that would last for generations. 25:16, medical geneticists began tracking the long-term effects of Appalachian inbreeding. They found elevated rates of nearly every genetic disorder. Heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, neurological disorders, and cancers of types rarely seen in the general population. The genetic bottleneck created by generations of cousin marriages had amplified every harmful recessive gene, creating populations where being healthy was the exception rather than the rule. 25:49, some families tried to break the cycle. Young people who had escaped to cities for education returned with spouses from outside the mountains, deliberately introducing new genetic material. But even this wasn't a perfect solution. The children of these unions were healthier, but they often carried hidden recessive genes that could express themselves in future generations. 26:16, a woman might leave the mountains, marry a man from Ohio, and give birth to a child who seemed perfectly healthy, only for that child's children to manifest conditions inherited from the mountain-dwelling grandparents. The families that remained in isolation continued their patterns. In 2005, researchers revisited the areas where the Fugates, Whittakers, and Colts had lived and found that while those specific families had dispersed or died out, other families had taken their place. 26:50, new surnames, same genetic patterns, same results. The mountains bred isolation, isolation bred genetic closure, and the cycle continued regardless of which names appeared in the family Bible. Environmental factors compounded the genetic damage. The poverty of Appalachia meant poor nutrition, limited medical care, and exposure to environmental toxins from coal mining and manufacturing. 27:15, children already weakened by genetic disorders faced additional challenges from contaminated water, air pollution, and diets deficient in essential nutrients. The combination created a perfect storm of health problems that transcended simple genetics. Today, the hollow where the blue fugates lived is quiet. The old homesteads have collapsed into the earth, reclaimed by the forests that always surrounded them. 27:45, but the genetic legacy persists, hidden in the DNA of descendants scattered across Kentucky and beyond. A man in Lexington discovers he carries the gene for methemoglobinemia when his daughter is born with a faint blue tint. A woman in Louisville learns she has an elevated risk for heart disease traced back to 4 generations of cousin marriages in her family tree. 28:11, the mountains may have released their physical grip, but the genetic consequences echo forward. The Whitaker family's story has no happy ending. Some members received care in group homes, their lives structured and supervised by professionals who understand their limitations. Others remain in the mountains, cared for by relatives only slightly less impaired than themselves. 28:35, the family's genetic load is so heavy that even marrying outsiders can't fully dilute it. Recessive genes hide in the DNA of seemingly healthy family members, waiting for the random lottery of reproduction to bring them together again. The Colt compound was demolished, the land sold. 28:58, the family scattered to various institutions and foster homes. But genetic studies of the family continue, providing scientists with valuable, if horrifying, data about the effects of extreme inbreeding. The children removed from the compound in the 1980s are now adults themselves, many struggling with health problems and the psychological trauma of their upbringing. 29:23, some have chosen not to have children, breaking the genetic chain through conscious decision rather than chance. Scientists estimate that in Appalachia alone, thousands of people carry genetic signatures of historical inbreeding. The effects range from invisible carrier status to profound disability, creating a spectrum of genetic burden that will take generations to fully dissipate. 29:49, some communities have embraced genetic counseling with young couples testing their DNA before marriage to understand what risks they carry. Others reject such modern interventions, viewing genetic testing as an insult to family heritage or an unwelcome intrusion into private matters. The social stigma attached to these families has softened slightly. 30:13, mental health awareness and genetic education have helped some people understand that the victims of inbreeding weren't cursed or punished by divine forces. They were simply unlucky inheritors of a genetic legacy created by isolation and limited choices. But stigma persists, particularly in the communities where these families lived. Being known as a descendant of the blue people or the mentally impaired families carries social consequences that outlast the genetic ones. 30:46, the mountains themselves remain indifferent to the human dramas played out in their hollows. New families have moved into some of the old homesteads, drawn by the beauty and isolation that once trapped earlier residents. Most are outsiders seeking escape from urban life. But a few are descendants of the old families returning to land that holds their genetic history in its soil. 31:12, they farm the same fields, draw water from the same streams, and sometimes marry within the extended family. Because despite everything, the mountains still impose a kind of isolation. Economic development has changed Appalachia, but hasn't erased its fundamental character. The hollows remain remote. 31:35, the poverty persists and the families who stayed continue to navigate a world where their genetic past affects their present and future. A young woman discovers that her chronic fatigue traces back to her great-great-grandparents who were first cousins. A man learns that his heart condition is shared by 15 relatives across 4 generations, all connected through a series of cousin marriages in the 1920s. 32:02, medical science has advanced tremendously since Dr. Corin first encountered the blue fugates, but genetics still doesn't offer easy fixes for the legacy of inbreeding. Gene therapy, CRISPR, and advanced reproductive technologies hold promise, but they remain expensive and largely unavailable to the descendants of Appalachian families who carry genetic burdens. 32:29, Most manage their conditions with medication, lifestyle changes, and acceptance of limitations that healthy populations never consider. The 20 secrets of Appalachia aren't really secrets anymore. They're documented in scientific journals, featured in documentaries, analyzed in medical schools across the country. But knowing the secrets doesn't erase their effects. 32:52, the blue skin, the cognitive impairments, the physical deformities, these were visible manifestations of a deeper truth about what happens when human populations become too isolated, too closed, too reluctant to mix with outsiders. The families profiled in this investigation represent just a fraction of the genetic damage caused by Appalachian isolation. 33:20, for every Fugate, Whitaker, and Colt documented by researchers, dozens of other families suffered similar fates in hollows so remote that scientists never found them. Some died out entirely, their genetic legacy ending when the last impaired family member passed away. Others continue, hidden from outsiders, managing their conditions with a mixture of mountain wisdom and modern medicine when they can access it. 33:46, the story of Appalachian inbreeding is ultimately a story about the consequences of isolation in all its forms. Geographic isolation created social isolation, which enforced genetic isolation, which produced physical and mental conditions that reinforced all three types of isolation. Breaking the cycle required more than just building roads or mandating education. 34:12, it required a fundamental shift in how these communities understood family, marriage, and their relationship to the outside world. Today, young people from these families have choices their ancestors never imagined. They can leave the mountains for education and careers, marry partners from anywhere in the world, and use genetic testing to make informed decisions about reproduction. 34-38, some exercise these choices, deliberately breaking the patterns that governed their families for generations. Others choose to stay, to marry locally, to maintain connections to land and family that transcend concerns about genetic diversity. Both choices are valid. Both come with consequences, and both reflect the complex legacy of a past that can never be completely erased. 35:05, the mountains stand silent, keeping whatever secrets remain undiscovered. But for those who lived through the genetic consequences of isolation, for the descendants who carry hidden risks in their DNA, and for the communities that must reconcile their past with their present, the 20 secrets of Appalachia are less folklore and more a genetic inheritance that echoes through generations. A reminder that some choices affect not just those who make them, but everyone who comes after. 35:35, if you've watched until the very end of this investigation, you understand that these weren't just statistics or medical curiosities. These were real families whose choices, limited as they were, created ripples that continue today. Stories this important need to be told, remembered, and understood so that history doesn't repeat itself in other isolated places. 36:17, if this investigation opened your eyes to the hidden realities of genetic isolation, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most disturbing secrets aren't supernatural. They're written in our DNA. The forgotten secrets of Appalachia remind us that isolation, whether chosen or imposed, always comes with a price paid by generations yet unborn.